His wife handles everything now, and he never noticed when it happened. There is a particular moment that arrives, unannounced, in the lives of many older men, often triggered by something small: a doctor's appointment. His wife casually mentions rescheduling. A birthday card from a cousin whose name he only vaguely recognizes. A simple question from a grandchild he cannot answer. And in that small moment, something much larger quietly reveals itself. He genuinely does not know how his own life actually runs. He never noticed the exact day it happened, but somewhere across 4 decades of marriage, his wife became the operating system underneath his entire existence, and he became, without ever intending to, a passenger in his own household. The wise observer has watched this pattern unfold in countless marriages, and it deserves far more honest attention than it typically receives. This isn't a story about a lazy husband or a domineering wife. It's a story about how gradual, invisible shifts in responsibility can accumulate over decades, until one day a man looks up and realizes he genuinely could not tell you his own children's dentist, his wife's closest friend's last name, or which bills are due on which day of the month. To understand how this happens, the wise observer must look at how these marriages typically began. In the early years, many of these couples describe something closer to equal partnership, both learning to manage a household together, both contributing knowledge and effort in roughly equal measure. But somewhere along the way, usually so gradually that neither partner could point to the exact turning point, a quiet specialization began to take hold. She remembered the birthdays first, just once, because he was busy with something else that particular week. She scheduled the doctor's appointment because it was simply faster than waiting for him to do it. She learned the names of his coworkers' spouses because she was naturally better at retaining that kind of social detail, and it seemed at the time like a perfectly reasonable division of labor. The trouble is that this division of labor was never actually discussed, negotiated, or agreed upon as a permanent arrangement. It simply accumulated, one small default at a time, until the small defaults became an entire operating system that only one person in the marriage fully understood. And because it happened so slowly, so painlessly in the moment, neither partner ever quite registered how significant the accumulation had become until decades had already passed. Consider what this actually looks like in practice. In the daily texture of an average older marriage, she knows which grandchild has a peanut allergy and which one prefers grape jelly over strawberry. She knows the name of the mechanic they've used for 15 years, the number for the pharmacy, the specific way his mother liked her coffee before she passed away. He knows none of these things not because he's incapable of knowing them, but because he was never the one who had to know them, and after enough years of not needing to know, the knowing itself simply atrophied, the way any unused skill eventually does. The wise observer wants to name something uncomfortable but important here. This arrangement, however unintentional, often serves him quite well for decades, right up until the moment it doesn't. As long as she remains healthy, present, and willing to continue, managing the invisible architecture of the household, he can move through his entire life blissfully unaware of how dependent he actually is. It's only when something threatens that arrangement, an illness, a hospitalization, an argument serious enough that she genuinely considers stepping back, that the full scope of the dependency becomes impossible to ignore. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this experience with real clarity. His wife is hospitalized unexpectedly for a minor procedure, nothing life-threatening, but requiring a few days away from home. Within 24 hours, he cannot locate the insurance cards, doesn't know which pharmacy fills which prescription, has no idea when the mortgage payment is due, and has to call his adult daughter, slightly panicked, to ask basic questions about a household he has technically lived in for 30 years. His wife returns from the hospital to find not a crisis, exactly, but a household that has been quietly, almost comically, unable to function smoothly without her, a preview, however brief, of something far more serious that both of them try not to think about too directly. The wise observer wants to be honest about the fear underneath this pattern, because it deserves to be named plainly rather than danced around. Many men in this position carry a quiet, persistent dread about what would actually happen if something happened to her permanently, not just practically, in terms of managing bills and appointments, but existentially, in terms of who he would even be without the invisible infrastructure she has provided for so many decades. This fear rarely gets spoken aloud. It's simply there, humming quietly beneath the surface of an otherwise ordinary marriage, occasionally surfacing during a health scare or a particularly vivid nightmare he doesn't mention over breakfast. It's worth examining how this pattern intersects with his broader relationship to competence and identity. Many men from this generation built their entire sense of self around being capable, self-sufficient, the one who handles things. Discovering, often quite late in life, that there's an entire category of household competence he simply never developed can feel genuinely destabilizing, even shameful, in ways he struggles to articulate even to himself. It's one thing to not know how to bake bread. It's another thing entirely to not know his own grandchildren's school schedules, and that particular gap can feel less like a minor oversight and more like evidence of some deeper failure as a husband and father. There's a specific tenderness worth naming in how this realization, when it finally arrives, can actually strengthen rather than damage a marriage, if both partners approach it with honesty rather than blame. Many couples describe a genuine turning point once he finally acknowledges the imbalance directly, not with dramatic apology, but with quiet, practical curiosity, finally asking her to teach him the things he never learned, where the pharmacy is, how the online banking actually works, which grandchild has which allergy. This process rarely happens all at once. It usually unfolds slowly, awkwardly, over months, as he relearns a version of competence he abandoned decades earlier without ever quite realizing he was abandoning it. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge something important about his wife's experience in all of this, because the pattern affects her just as significantly, if less visibly. Many women in this position describe a complicated mixture of resentment and quiet pride. Resentment at having carried the invisible mental load of an entire household for decades without acknowledgement. Pride in her own competence and indispensability, and often a genuine fear of her own about what would happen to him if she weren't there to catch the details he's never learned to catch himself. This fear, ironically, sometimes keeps her from stepping back even when she's exhausted, because the risk of him genuinely struggling feels, to her, worse than simply continuing to carry the weight alone. It's worth naming, too, how this dynamic shifts the closer couples get to genuine mortality concerns. As health becomes a more present concern in their 60s and 70s, many of these men experience a growing, urgent motivation to finally learn what they never learned, not out of guilt exactly, but out of a real, practical fear of leaving his own life unmanageable if something happens to her first. This late-arriving effort, however imperfect, often becomes one of the more meaningful projects of his later years, relearning his own life, piece by piece, from a teacher who has been quietly waiting, for decades, for him to finally ask. There's a particular irony worth naming in how selectively this dependency manifests. He may be entirely capable of managing a complex work project, negotiating a business deal, or fixing an intricate mechanical problem, and yet remain genuinely unable to name his own grandchildren's teachers or locate the birth certificates in his own filing cabinet. This isn't a matter of general incompetence. It's a matter of where his mental effort was directed for decades outward, toward provider responsibilities that felt urgent and visible, while the domestic architecture of the household quietly became someone else's exclusive expertise, unnoticed precisely because it never once failed to function. It's worth examining how this pattern intersects with a particular blind spot around his wife's own health and well-being. Because she has spent so many years being the one who notices, remembers, and manages, he can sometimes fail to notice when she herself is struggling, exhausted, overwhelmed, quietly resentful precisely because noticing was never a skill he needed to develop domestically, no matter how attentive and caring he remained in every other part of their shared life. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how this pattern often gets confronted directly for the first time. During a rare argument, exhausted after managing yet another forgotten detail he assumed simply handled itself, she finally says something she's never said quite so plainly before. "Do you actually know how any of this works?" The question lands harder than she perhaps intended, not because it's cruel, but because it's completely, undeniably accurate, and he finds himself genuinely unable to answer with anything beyond an uncomfortable silence. The wise observer wants to point out something specific about how adult children often notice this pattern long before either parent fully acknowledges it themselves. Grown children frequently describe unease watching their father navigate basic household questions with visible confusion, a realization dawning that their parents' entire domestic partnership rests almost entirely on their mother's continued presence. This can create anticipatory worry in adult children, who sometimes begin quietly preparing themselves, years in advance, for the practical crisis they suspect will unfold if their mother's health falters before their father has learned to manage independently. It's worth noting, too, how this pattern shows up specifically around technology and modern household management, an area where the generational gap can make his dependency particularly stark. Online banking passwords, subscription services, digital calendars, coordinating a dozen family obligations. These systems were often built and maintained entirely by her, sometimes because she genuinely enjoyed the organizational challenge, sometimes simply because waiting for him to learn felt less efficient than doing it herself. Either way, the result is often the same: an entire digital infrastructure of family life that exists almost exclusively in her head and her passwords, invisible and essential in equal measure. There's a particular tenderness worth naming in how many men describe the actual process of finally learning these systems once they commit to doing so. Far from feeling emasculating, as some initially fear, many describe a genuine, almost boyish satisfaction in mastering something new this late in life, learning to navigate the online pharmacy portal, memorizing which grandchild has which allergy, finally understanding the family calendar well enough to notice a scheduling conflict himself instead of relying on her to catch it. This late learning often becomes, unexpectedly, a genuine source of pride and renewed partnership rather than simple remedial catching up. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how this pattern intersects with grief anticipation specifically, because it deserves honest attention rather than avoidance. Many men in their 60s and 70s privately rehearse, in quiet, unguarded moments, exactly what losing their wife would actually mean, not just emotionally, but logistically, practically, in ways that feel almost too mundane to voice aloud, given the gravity of the underlying fear. Learning the household's hidden architecture, then, becomes not just a practical project but a quiet act of love and preparation, a way of honoring what she has carried for so long by finally, deliberately, learning to carry some of it himself. There's one final observation worth making before closing, because it offers something genuinely practical rather than simply diagnostic. Couples who navigate this realization most successfully tend to treat it not as a referendum on the past, but as a concrete, collaborative project for the years ahead, sitting down together, sometimes with a notebook, sometimes with an adult child helping facilitate, and simply documenting the invisible architecture she's carried for so long. Passwords written down, doctors' names listed, the mechanic, the pharmacy, the insurance details, all transferred deliberately from her memory into something shared. This isn't a romantic gesture in the traditional sense, but for many couples in their later years, it becomes one of the most meaningful acts of partnership they undertake together. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you are a man who recently realized his wife handles everything, understand that this realization, uncomfortable as it feels, is not a verdict on your worth as a husband or a father. It's simply the visible edge of a pattern that formed slowly, invisibly, over years of ordinary daily choices that neither of you consciously made as a permanent arrangement. The valuable response isn't shame about the decades already past, but genuine curiosity about the years still ahead, sitting down, finally, and asking her to teach you the actual architecture of the life you've been sharing all along, before the asking becomes something far more urgent than simple curiosity.